The Ferris wheel was turning. I remember that detail with a kind of sick clarity, because everything else in the tower felt wrong in ways I could still excuse. The radio had gone soft with static. The security monitors kept rolling a thin band of snow through the bottom of each feed. There was a smell in the air that didn't belong there, burnt popcorn and hot sugar, like somebody had just cracked open a fresh kettle on the Midway, except every stand in Blackwater Shores had been shuttered for hours, and the old concessions nearest the wheel had been dead for years. Outside the glass, the whole park sat black against the lakeshore. No marquee lights, no ride lights, no flood lamps on the maintenance road. Power had gone down across the property less than 10 minutes earlier, and I knew it was a full shutdown because I'd been the one sent to confirm the backup transfer failed. That wheel should have been a still shape over the trees. Just metal, just silhouette. Instead it moved. Slowly. Smoothly. Not coasting on leftover momentum. Not groaning from a bad lock pin. But rotating with the easy, deliberate pace of something that had decided to turn. I leaned over the tower rail and started counting the passenger cars because that was what Rule 2 said to do if the Ferris wheel began moving. I counted once, exactly once. 23. The wheel at Blackwater Shores only had 22 cars. I checked that earlier that week during a daylight perimeter walk because one had been removed for repainting 3 summers ago, then replaced from old stock. Maintenance paperwork still noted the mismatch in paint shade. 23 cars kept moving through the dark. 23 black shapes. One of them passed the top without catching any starlight at all, like it was made from a darker piece of night than the rest. I didn't know yet why the rules cared so much about certain rides. That was 4 nights into the job. I took the overnight position at Blackwater Shores Adventure Park because I needed something steady, and because steady was how the listing made it sound. Seasonal park, reduced attendance, lakeside property on the outskirts of Erie County, Pennsylvania, overnight security assistant, monitor cameras, walk the grounds, check gates, report maintenance hazards. I had done loss prevention in big box stores, door work at a concert venue, and 2 years of night security in a medical office complex where the most exciting thing that ever happened was a raccoon getting into the dumpster enclosure. I was used to long hours, bad coffee, and people over-explaining simple jobs to see if the new guy would nod along. So when Maribel Joyce Keegan sat me down in the security office on my first night and slid a laminated card across the desk with 7 rules on it, I thought I was being sized up for a joke. The office smelled like dust, printer toner, and the lake. Somewhere above us a vent clicked, then went quiet. Maribel didn't smile when I picked up the card. She was in her late 40s, maybe compact, tired around the eyes in a way that suggested habit instead of weakness. She wore her park windbreaker zipped all the way up even though it was warm inside, and she watched me read like she was waiting for me to miss something obvious. The rules were short, specific, ridiculous. Do not look directly into the hall of mirrors after 1 in the morning. If the Ferris wheel begins moving, count the cars exactly once. Never enter the children's train tunnel after the final departure. If carousel music starts without power, leave the Midway immediately. Do not acknowledge employees wearing vintage uniforms. When Ride 7 appears on the map, avoid that section of the park. At sunrise, verify the number of exits before opening any gate. I looked up from the card and waited for the punchline. It didn't come. What happens if I break one? I asked. Maribel folded her hands on the desk. Her knuckles were nicked, grease in the lines, like she handled equipment herself. Then we'll all have a longer night. That wasn't the answer of somebody running a prank. It was too flat, too practiced. I gave a little laugh anyway. This for everybody, or just the new hires? Overnight only, she said. Day shift doesn't need them. From the corner of the room, Rowan Patrick Doyle snorted without looking up from the open control box on the floor in front of him. He was the ride technician, thin and sharp-featured, with the kind of concentration that made him seem annoyed even when he wasn't. There were wires draped over his knee and a flashlight balanced between his shoulder and jaw. He smelled faintly of machine oil and cold air, like he'd just come in from outside. You won't think they're funny by Friday, he said. I told him I'd try to survive the week. At the time, I thought the rules were park culture. Every place has its mythology. Warehouses have ghost stories about the loading dock. Hospitals have rooms nobody likes to use. Old venues invent traditions because people on bad schedules get weird together. Blackwater Shores was exactly the kind of place that bred lore. It had opened in the late 1970s, done well for a while, then started shrinking one unfinished season at a time. By the year I was hired, half the original attractions were closed permanently. Another quarter operated only on weekends, and whole chunks of the property had the abandoned stillness of something waiting to be remembered. Faded signs, empty prize booths, queue rails leading nowhere. Should have felt sad. Didn't. Even on my first walk, before midnight, before the power failure, before the wheel, there were pockets of the park that felt occupied in the way a room feels occupied when someone has just stepped out of it. Warm air around inactive rides. A drifting thread of carnival music so faint I thought it was just tinnitus until I stopped and heard wind over the lake sitting above it like a second layer. Burnt popcorn in closed corridors. Strongest near places that hadn't served food in years. I reported the smell once over the radio. Maribel told me not to worry unless it was sweet enough to make my eyes water. That answer stuck with me. The first few hours of night shift were boring enough to almost make me relax. We locked the employee gate, checked the perimeter fencing on the lakeside, and walked the midway while the last of the cleaning crew finished up. The park looked harmless in pieces. The carousel under its canvas cover. The shuttered arcade with its dark prize wall. The hall of mirrors squatting at the far end of Old Harbor Lane. Its painted facade peeling in loops that looked like old sunburn. Rowan disappeared twice into maintenance corridors that weren't marked on the guest maps. Maribel kept stopping to note things on a clipboard I never got a clean look at. By a quarter to midnight, the place felt too large for the three of us. That detail seemed minor then. I think about it every day now. I made my second round past the Ferris wheel just before the power died. The air there had gone strangely warm, almost humid, though the rest of the park was cooling fast after sunset. The gondolas hung still. I tapped my flashlight up the support lattice, checked the gate chain at the platform, and moved on. Somewhere behind me, beneath the rattle of leaves, I heard a few notes of calliope music and turned far enough to see the carousel building sitting black and silent on the other side of the midway. Then every light on the property went out. The shutdown hit so cleanly that for a second I thought I'd gone blind. The midway vanished. My radio crackled. From somewhere deeper in the park came a metal knock, then another, like a ride settling under stress. Emergency strips should have lit in the paths, but they didn't. I called it in, and Maribel sent me to the tower to confirm whether backup had kicked over at the main panel. It hadn't. That was how I ended up counting 23 passenger cars on a powerless Ferris wheel. When the wheel stopped, it did it all at once. No gradual slowdown. No mechanical complaint. One moment it was rotating, and the next it had locked in place with a hard shudder that I felt through the tower floor. The smell of burnt popcorn thickened so quickly it caught in the back of my throat. I stared at the passenger cars hanging in the dark and started counting again before I remembered the rule. Exactly once. Maribel had been weirdly precise about that. I went down the tower stairs 2 at a time, crossed the service path, and cut through the wheel queue with my flashlight up. The beam jittered across empty loading gates, chain links, faded safety decals. 22 cars hung around the rim. I counted them 3 times because now the rule had already been broken and I wanted the comfort of a normal answer. 22. I climbed the platform stairs, checked the locking bracket on the nearest car, and found it cold to the touch. Not just cool from the night air. Cold like metal taken out of a freezer. When I swung the beam into its cabin, the seat was damp, and for half a second I caught the smell of lake mud over the popcorn. Preston Wade Hollis. Maribel's voice snapped across the dark from the base of the platform. I nearly dropped the light. She stood below me with Rowan a few steps behind her, both of them looking up, neither one seeming especially surprised by the wheel. Maribel's face was unreadable in the beam. "Did you count?" she asked. "Yeah." "How many?" I hesitated. 23 from the tower. 22 now. Rowan closed his eyes for a second like he'd heard a diagnosis he didn't like but expected. Maribel nodded once. "Good. Come down." "Good," I said. "That's good. It means it kept moving, Rowan said. It would have been worse if it stopped at 23. I came down the stairs and followed them to the maintenance office because there was finally a problem I could document, and documentation was a language I understood. The office smelled of damp concrete and old coffee. Rowan pulled up the park schematics on an offline terminal while Maribel lit a battery lantern and set it on the desk between us. The terminal was disconnected from network access during overnight hours. I noticed that because I still believed systems behaved like systems. Rowan brought up the Ferris wheel blueprint, then the refurbishment record from 3 summers earlier. 22 cars. Every maintenance log since then confirmed the same number. There, I said, pointing at the screen like I could pin reality back into place with paperwork. So either I miscounted in the dark, or somebody added a car and didn't file it. Rowan looked at me, and there was something like pity in it. You didn't miscount. The battery lantern hummed softly. Somewhere outside, I heard wind moving through Q chains. Then where'd it go? I asked. Neither of them answered. Maribel took the laminated rule card from her pocket and tapped the second line with one finger. You did what you were supposed to do. That's all I need from you right now. That should have been the moment I quit. I know that. A rational person finishes that shift, hands in the badge, and finds work somewhere with fewer impossible moving parts. But fear doesn't always make you leave. Sometimes it makes you focus. It narrows the world down to procedure and sequence and the next thing you can verify with your own hands. So I kept working. Just after midnight, while we were still on limited emergency power, Maribel sent me to walk the eastern promenade and confirm the outer game stalls were still locked. The promenade was one of the older sections of Blackwater Shores, built wide enough for summer crowds that didn't come anymore. My flashlight swept over shuttered ring-toss booths, a cracked photo kiosk, and the closed facade of a fried dough stand with a painted chef whose smile had peeled into something jagged. The air was colder there until I reached the bend toward Old Harbor Lane, where a bloom of heat rolled over me without warning, as if I'd stepped through the exhaust from an invisible generator. Then I heard brushing. Not footsteps, not wheels, bristles. Slow, even strokes against concrete. I killed my light on instinct and stood still. 3 figures moved along the lane ahead of me in dark uniforms with pale trim, sweeping the walkway beneath the dead bulbs. Their posture was wrong first. Too upright, too even. They weren't talking to one another. They weren't looking around. They were simply progressing forward, each of them making the same precise sweeping motion with a long-handled broom that seemed to pass over litter without ever gathering any of it. The sound reached me a second late, like the bristles were dragging across the idea of the ground before the actual surface. I raised the flashlight again, not directly at them, just enough to catch detail. The uniforms were old. Not movie old, not costume shop old. Real fabric. Structured jackets with brass buttons, high collars, striped cuffs, the sort of theme park staff formal wear you saw in promotional photos from the late 20th century. One of the figures had a cap with the Blackwater Shores crest stitched in a style I recognized from a framed newspaper clipping in the front office. Retired decades earlier. They kept moving. I called out, "Park security." None of them reacted. One passed close enough to catch in full beam, and I saw that he was carrying a folded newspaper tucked beneath one arm. The paper was clean and white, not yellowed, and the date on the front above the masthead read August 14th, 2056. My mouth went dry. He didn't look at me. None of them did. But as they passed, I felt a little pulse of warmth around them. Not body heat exactly, more like standing too close to an idling piece of machinery. I also noticed something else that made the skin tighten at the back of my neck. Their shoes made no sound. The brooms did. The buttons clicked faintly when they moved. Fabric whispered. But their steps landed in complete silence. I started after them anyway, because by then confusion had outrun caution. "Stop," I said. "I need to see your badges." One of them turned his head by a fraction. Not enough to face me. Just enough that I saw the edge of a cheek and the shine of an eye that seemed to reflect more light than my flashlight was putting out. Then Maribel's hand clamped hard around my forearm. "Don't," she said. She had come up without a sound herself, Rowan behind her with a toolbox in one hand. Maribel didn't even look at the figures. She kept her eyes on me. Back away. Who are they? I whispered. Not your concern. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. The figures continued down Old Harbor Lane, turned past the shuttered candy counter, and vanished behind the dark shell of the Hall of Mirrors. Vanished was the only word for it. There was no place for three people to disappear in that open a stretch of pavement that fast. I looked back at Maribel. They're on no employee roster I've seen. I know, she said. Then why are they here? Rowan shifted the toolbox from one hand to the other. I could smell grease and ozone off him. Because things still need doing. He said it like that was enough. Maribel let go of my arm and pointed toward the main midway. You're done on this side for the night. I should have argued harder. Instead, I let them steer me away, because something in her voice said this wasn't a conversation she was refusing out of stubbornness. It was one she was refusing because naming the wrong thing in the wrong place could make it worse. As we crossed back toward the brighter part of the park, I glanced over my shoulder. One of the vintage employees had stopped in the lane and was now facing our direction from too far away for facial detail. The newspaper still rested beneath his arm. Though the air had cooled again, I could smell burnt popcorn stronger than ever, and underneath it, faint and thin, the tune of a carousel waltz playing somewhere there shouldn't have been power for anything to play. I didn't understand yet that the park was teaching me its categories. By 1 in the morning, every stupid rule on the card had stopped feeling stupid. That was when the map changed. The overnight security tablet we used for patrol routes was old, ruggedized, and half held together by case screws that didn't match. It ran local software only. No wireless after close. Rowan had mentioned that on my first night while complaining about management refusing to replace equipment. So when I was standing beside the shuttered arcade checking camera blind spots and saw the park map redraw itself under my thumb, my first thought wasn't supernatural. It was firmware corruption. The screen flickered. Path lines shifted. Several guest icons vanished. Then a new label bloomed on the northern edge of the property in pale blue text. Ride 7. I stopped walking. Blackwater Shores had named attractions, not numbers. Storm Harbor, Lantern Drop, The Pike, Children's Express. Even old rides that no longer operated still carried their branded names in the system archives. There was no Ride 7. Nothing on the public map. Nothing in the employee handbook. Nothing in the maintenance records I'd seen when Rowan pulled up the Ferris wheel schematics. I zoomed in. The label sat beyond the old bumper boats lot, in a section of land that should have been empty except for service fencing and a retired drainage cut. As I watched, the route line adjusted itself and drew a dotted access path into the dark. No network, no updates, no reason. I radioed Maribel and got only static. I tried Rowan. Same thing. That was how I ended up walking toward a ride that didn't exist. The farther I went from the main midway, the quieter the park got, but not in a natural way. The wind off the lake seemed to turn aside from that section. My own steps sounded muffled. The smell of burnt popcorn thinned out and gave way to damp earth and hot metal. Twice I passed through bands of warm air that clung to my face and wrists like breath. The tablet screen kept pulsing the label at me from ahead. Ride 7. I reached the service fence and found the chain on the gate hanging open. That stopped me colder than the dark did. I had checked that gate before close. I remembered the rust bloom on the latch and the way it caught unless you lifted it slightly. Locked then. Open now. Beyond it lay a strip of packed dirt that sloped toward the drainage cut. My flashlight picked out fresh track marks. Not tire treads. Narrow twin grooves in the soil, as if small steel wheels had passed there recently. I followed them past a stack of old barrier posts and came into a clearing that should not have held what it held. Q rails. Not scraps. Not junk waiting disposal. Installed rails, fixed in looping lines over a poured concrete pad I had never seen on any map. A ride entrance arch stood at the front of them with no sign panel fitted in the frame. Just empty brackets. To the right sat a maintenance cart with the Blackwater Shores logo on the door and a ring of keys in the ignition. To the left were power boxes half sunk into the ground, all of them tagged with inspection stickers from months that had not happened yet. My scalp prickled under my cap. The tablet chirped softly in my hand. The map zoomed in on its own, and for a second I watched it place my location at the start of the queue. Then another icon appeared farther ahead. Not a person icon. A little square marker that rotated in place like a ride car on a blueprint. I lifted the beam. Tracks disappeared into the drainage cut. Only they weren't drainage tracks. They were amusement ride rails, narrow and polished at the top, running down into a tunnel mouth that the county ought to have known about and that absolutely had not been there during the day. Above it hung a weathered sign frame with all lettering stripped away. I could smell grease, hot dust, and something sweet and stale like cotton candy kept too long in plastic. The tablet updated again. The label Ride 7 blinked, then the route line shifted backward, as if advising retreat. Beneath the map, a status field I had never seen before appeared for less than a second. Do not queue. Then the whole screen went black. I don't mind telling you I almost ran right then. But the professional part of me, the stubborn part that still wanted one solid answer, took over first. I tried the power button. Nothing. I smacked the casing. Still nothing. When I looked up again, something on the other side of the queue had changed. There was now a length of yellow rope hanging between two chrome stanchions that had been bare a moment earlier. The rope was swaying. Not from wind. There wasn't any. From something brushing past it. I backed up slowly, every nerve waiting for a human shape, an animal, anything that would restore scale to what I was seeing. Instead, I heard a sound rise from the tunnel below the tracks. Not a growl. Not a machine. It was the layered clatter of a ride climbing a chain lift heard from too far underground, mixed with the overlapping chatter of people waiting in line. High voices, coughs, a laugh cut off mid-burst. Then, from directly behind me, the tablet gave a bright, cheerful tone and restarted. The map was back to normal. No Ride 7. No dotted path. No queue. No icon. I swung the flashlight around the clearing. The concrete pad was still there. So were the rails and arch. But the maintenance cart was gone. And the fresh inspection stickers I could have sworn I'd seen were now blank silver tabs catching my beam. That was the first moment the park stopped feeling haunted and started feeling organized. When I got back to the main midway, Maribel was waiting near the shuttered lemonade stand with her arms crossed, as if she had known exactly where I was going and how long it would take me to come back. Rowan stood beside her with a folded map in one hand and a socket wrench in the other. The music under the wind had grown clearer. Not louder exactly, just closer to the surface. "Tell me you didn't go down there," Maribel said. I held up the dead tablet. "Your map routed me there." Rowan took the device from me, turned it over, and frowned. "Battery's full." "It shut off." "No," he said. "It hid." I stared at him. He stared back like he'd said something as practical as low tire pressure. "There is no Ride 7 on any official map," I said. "So either somebody's built an entire attraction in a restricted zone without permits, or you're both out of your minds." Maribel nodded once toward the east end of the midway. "Go verify the Hall of Mirrors facade is still locked." She was redirecting me on purpose. I knew it. I also knew that if I kept pressing in the open, I was going to get nowhere. So I took the tablet back and went. The Hall of Mirrors sat alone at the edge of Old Harbor Lane, its marquee dark, its painted glass panels throwing back scraps of my flashlight as I approached. The building had been closed to guests for years, the ticket window boarded from inside, the side exit chained. I checked the front padlock. Secure. I checked the emergency bar on the rear service door. Secure. I should have marked it down and walked away. Instead, I remembered Rule 1. Do not look directly into the Hall of Mirrors after 1 in the morning. A rule like that doesn't sit well with certain kinds of people. Tell a person not to touch a live panel, they understand. Tell them not to stand under a suspended load, they understand. There's a reason, process, a mechanism. But don't look directly into a dark attraction after a specific hour. That sounds like folklore, and folklore makes you want to prove you're above it. I stepped to the side of the ticket window where a narrow strip of glass inside the facade hadn't been painted over and lifted my flashlight. At first I thought I was just seeing my own beam break across mirrors at odd angles. Light doing what light does. Then I realized there were no reflections of me at all. What I saw inside the Hall of Mirrors was a park. Not the interior of the attraction. Not shattered copies of my face. Park. Blackwater shores, but fuller somehow, deeper, extending into directions I knew the property did not physically extend. Midways lit in colors the real bulbs outside me didn't carry. Attractions moving that had been dead for decades. Crowds flowing through spaces that were now storage yards and closed walkways. The air through the glass smelled wrong, warm and sweet and wet, with the thick odor of lake water under burnt sugar. I lowered the flashlight, and the image remained. People moved in there. Too many of them. Guests in clothes from different eras passing shoulder to shoulder without seeming to notice the differences. Staff in current uniforms. Staff in the old brass button uniforms. A woman pushing a stroller beneath lights from a ride Blackwater Shores had demolished before I was born. A group of teenagers laughing as they headed toward a coaster the park had never actually built. At the center of it all turned the Ferris wheel. 23 cars. Only now I could see the extra one more clearly, because it did not reflect light the same way as the others. It seemed wrapped in a darkness with texture to it, like soaked velvet or feathers matted by rain. As it passed the top of the wheel, the doors along the nearest normal car opened, and something long-limbed unfolded from the shadow between them and crossed, not by climbing, but by stepping through the space where two cars should never have been close enough to touch. My breath fogged the glass. On the midway beyond the reflected wheel, the carousel began to turn. No music at first. Then the same waltz I had been hearing under the wind rose up from nowhere, and every figure in that impossible park seemed to shift its attention toward it at once. I should have looked away. Instead I kept watching and noticed something on the far side of the mirrored midway, half hidden behind a line of old game booths. A sign arch blank frame. Queue rails. Tracks running down into darkness. Ride 7. I felt a jolt of stupid triumph. There it was. Proof. One contained anomaly generating the rest. The Hall of Mirrors wasn't showing the park. It was creating it. A projection system. Some kind of impossible environmental bleed. A source. Then one of the reflected people on the other side of the glass turned and looked straight at me. Not at my reflection. At me. He was one of the vintage employees. Same brass buttons. Same cap. Same almost too bright eyes. The folded newspaper was still tucked under his arm. He raised one finger to his lips, not in warning, but in courtesy, as if asking me not to interrupt a performance. Something touched the inside of the glass from the darkness beside him. A hand, maybe, but with too many joints in it. I staggered back so fast my shoulder hit the ticket booth frame. The music inside cut off. Outside, the real Midway answered with 3 soft notes from the carousel building. Though the entire park still sat on limited power and nothing should have been able to play. That was the last moment I could have walked away and stayed myself. Once you think you understand a threat, you start making plans against it. Mine was simple. If the Hall of Mirrors was the source, then the source could be blocked, broken, dismantled, cut off from whatever fed it. Lock the facade harder. Board the remaining glass. Smash the interior mirror arrays if I had to. I wasn't proud of how quickly my mind turned to vandalism, but fear likes solutions, even bad ones. I headed for the maintenance shed behind Old Harbor Lane, where I knew Rowan kept impact tools and demolition bars. The music under the wind had spread by then. Not louder, wider. I could hear bits of it slipping between buildings from 3 directions at once. The smell of burnt popcorn came in heavy waves, and the warm patches in the air had stopped feeling accidental. They felt like boundaries. When I yanked the shed door open, Rowan Patrick Doyle was already inside. He was sitting on an overturned bucket beside a rack of spare parts, elbows on knees, like he'd been waiting for me. A work lamp ran off a portable battery at his feet, throwing hard shadows over stacked fiberglass horse bodies from old carousel repairs and crates of ride hardware tagged with dates in Maribel's handwriting. "No," he said before I could speak. "I wasn't asking." "I know." I grabbed for a pry bar hanging on the wall. Rowan stood up and took it out of my hand with irritating ease. He wasn't bigger than me. He just moved like he'd had this argument before. "You saw something in the mirrors," he said. "I saw the whole damn park in there." "Yeah." Then why are we pretending it isn't the problem? He studied me for a second. The shed smelled of oil, warm rubber, and lake damp seeping through the walls. Outside, something metallic clanked twice, then went still. Come with me, he said. I'm not in the mood for cryptic. Tough. He left through the rear door without checking whether I followed. I did, partly because anger had momentum, partly because the park outside had started feeling like a place where standing still invited other kinds of decisions. Rowan cut along a service route behind the game stalls, through a gap in decorative fencing, and down toward the abandoned train station near the edge of the children's section. The station had served a small park train years ago before budget cuts reduced the route to a single daytime loop, then shut it completely except for seasonal events. Rule 3 came back to me as we walked. Never enter the children's train tunnel after the final departure. The station platform smelled like wet wood and old grease. Rowan climbed up, crossed to the bench beneath the timetable board, and set down a clipboard I hadn't noticed him carrying. He flipped through pages under the weak service light. Maintenance logs, handwritten notes, times and symbols I didn't recognize. What are you doing? I asked. Finishing my route. He tore off a page, folded it once, then stepped to the edge of the platform where the dead track disappeared into the black mouth of the train tunnel. He placed the paper on the concrete, weighed it down with a metal bolt, and straightened. Then he looked into the tunnel and said, very calmly, "Thanks for cooperating tonight." I laughed once because the alternative was admitting how wrong it felt. Nothing answered. Then, all at once, the distant activity across the park stopped. The faint carousel melody cut out mid-phrase. A chain somewhere on the midway quit rattling. From far off near the wheel, a rhythmic squeak I'd barely been aware of ceased as cleanly as if someone had pressed mute on the property. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was attention. Rowan picked up the empty clipboard and stepped back from the tunnel edge. What? I said carefully. Did you just thank? He shrugged. The station tenant. It prefers written reports, but courtesy helps. I stared at him. Tenant. You're thinking like this is one thing wearing different masks, he said. It isn't. That's why smashing the mirrors won't help. So they are mirrors. They're observation points. Windows if you want the cheap version. They show traffic patterns, habitat overlap, sometimes timing. They're useful if you know what you're looking at. Dangerous if you don't. I could hear my pulse in my ears. You expect me to accept that there are tenants in rides. Not in rides, Rowan said. In the spaces the rides make. He saw from my face that it hadn't landed, so he tried again. You ever see what happens when a shopping mall closes for good? He asked. At first it's empty. Then birds get in through loading bays. Then mold. Then feral cats if the service doors stay open. Water finds the roof seams. Insects move through the wall voids. Pretty soon the building is a habitat whether anybody meant it to be or not. Blackwater Shores is like that, except what moved in here isn't anything your old job would recognize. The train tunnel breathed out a pocket of warm air that smelled faintly of sugar and machine grease. I took one step back. You talk like you've made peace with it. Rowan's expression did something strange then. Not a smile. Something softer and worse. I quit once. That surprised me more than the rest of it. What happened? I kept driving past on nights I didn't work, he said. Couldn't sleep when the weather changed. Started checking the county emergency logs to see if anybody had reported music near the shoreline. After a month, I was back inside the fence helping Maribel for free. He looked toward the tunnel again. Happens more than you'd think. To who? Former night staff. They don't all come back on payroll. Some just visit the parking lot. Some walk the perimeter at dawn. A few mail notes. Nobody gives the same reason, and nobody sounds convincing when they try. There it was. Not a ghost story. Something stickier. He turned to me and lowered his voice. Listen carefully, Preston Wade Hollis. The Hall of Mirrors is not making anything. It is showing you what was already there. You don't break a thermometer because you don't like the fever. From deeper in the tunnel came a soft clack, as though a small wheel had settled onto a rail. Then Maribel's voice barked over the radio, clear for the first time in 20 minutes. Both of you report to Center Midway. Now, migration's early. The word hit me wrong. Migration. By the time we reached the Center Midway, I had stopped trying to fit the night into the category of haunting. Hauntings are personal. They are built for storytelling. One place, one wronged history, one repeated act. What Maribel Joyce Keegan finally gave me instead was systems language, and systems language is colder because it doesn't care whether you're ready for it. She met us beside the carousel control booth with a ring of keys in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The park around us felt awake. Not lit. Awake. Warm patches pooled near ride entrances. Burnt popcorn drifted from the closed food court in a solid ribbon strong enough now to sting the eyes. Somewhere under the wind and over the lake hiss, carnival music rose and fell like an animal testing the edges of a cage. You wanted answers, Maribel said. Fine. You get enough to be useful. She pointed first toward the Ferris wheel looming over the east end of the park. That structure is a roost point after midnight. Rotation changes occupancy. Count tells us whether transfer is active and whether a transit compartment formed. 22 means dormant. 23 means one extra compartment attached. Do not recount because attention stabilizes it. Then she pointed toward the dark slot of the children's train route beyond the seasonal booths. Tunnel section becomes a den after final departure. If you enter, they take your route as permission and keep it. That's why nobody goes in after the last run. Her light moved to the shuttered hall of mirrors. Observation point. Sometimes future drift, sometimes old overlays, sometimes active corridors. It is not a source. It is a view. Then to the broad carousel canopy, silent for the moment. Sound nest. When music starts without power, leave the midway because the territory is being reassigned. I felt stupid for every simpler explanation I tried to build. What are they? I asked. Maribel didn't answer right away. She watched the dark gap between two game stalls as if expecting movement there. When she did speak, her voice had the careful shape of a person choosing usable words over accurate ones. Most of what we deal with isn't one species, if that word even fits. Think niches. Think overlap. Some favor tunnels. Some use ride mechanisms. Some gather where lines form and waiting leaves a residue. Human attention changes places. Repetition changes places. Music changes places. Once enough patterns layer over each other, something settles in. You're saying the park made them? No, Rowan said. Maribel nodded at him. He's right. The park organized them. That sentence changed the scale of everything. I think she saw it happen on my face because she finally gave me the piece that made the rest lock together. Blackwater Shores was built on a convergence point, she said, long before the park. Old survey notes mention temperature anomalies, sound carrying strangely over empty ground, animals avoiding certain depressions after dusk. Developers paved it, drove supports through it, set attractions over it, and by accident they created boundaries, routes, shelters. Artificial habitat. Better habitat than open land. Better containment too. She looked around the midway as she said it, not with affection exactly, but with the wary respect of a ranger discussing a dangerous preserve. So now we maintain it. We keep the property active, even reduced. We keep routes predictable. We count what needs counting. We don't abandon sections without preparing replacements. If this place ever closes completely and the structures rot unchecked, the boundaries go with them. Then the ecosystem doesn't disappear. It spreads. I heard distant traffic on the county road beyond the trees and suddenly understood why overnight staff existed at all. Not to protect ourselves, to protect everything outside the fence. Maribel kept going, because there wasn't time for me to process slowly. Vintage uniforms, she said. Don't acknowledge them. They coordinate some of the same boundaries we do. They mimic older staff eras because that shape fits the park's memory. They are not employees, but they are useful. Most nights. I remembered the future newspaper. Why the dates? We don't know. Time doesn't stick to every corridor the same way. Ride 7, I said. At that, Maribel and Rowan exchanged a glance. Rowan answered. Temporary corridor. shows up where routes open between habitats that don't normally touch. You saw infrastructure because infrastructure is how this place thinks. Rails, queue lines, loading zones. If the map tells you Ride 7 is active, it means a transit path has appeared somewhere it shouldn't. You avoid it because if you enter while it's assembling, it'll build around you. The warmth around us surged. The carousel gave one soft chime without moving. Maribel checked her watch. Just before 3 in the morning. They're starting. There are moments in a long bad night where fear becomes too expensive to keep paying for in full. You either break or you move. I moved. Maribel shoved a clipboard into my chest and pointed at a row of switch boxes along the midway. Follow instructions exactly, she said. You're documenting and relaying counts. No improvising. What am I counting now? Transitions. Then the migration began. It started at the Ferris wheel. From the center midway I could see the rim moving again in darkness. Not fast, just steady enough to make my stomach tighten. 22 regular cars tracked through the night like black pendulums. The extra compartment appeared only when it reached the upper third of the rotation, as if that part of the wheel passed through a layer that let it join. Each time it came into being, the air around us warmed and the burnt popcorn smell thickened until it felt like breathing through old sugar. Mark active transfer, Maribel said. I wrote it down. From beneath the wheel, shapes began to descend that I couldn't hold in one image. Limbs first, then angles, then the impression of folded frames opening. They did not climb out of the cars. They stepped between them when the spacing said they couldn't. Each crossing lost detail the moment it touched the platform shadow, as if whatever lived in rotation disliked being seen on the ground. One made a dry, ticking sound like seatbelts tapping against metal. Another left a damp arc across the loading boards that smelled unmistakably of lake mud. They moved toward the carousel. Not quickly, inevitably. At the same time, the children's train tunnel exhaled. The black mouth at the far end of the family section issued a ribbon of warm mist that spread low over the pavement. Something small and fast ran through it under the benches, too low to catch in full light. Then another. Then many. I heard the faint clatter of wheels, except there were no visible carts, no train, no hardware moving, just the sound of things following rails that weren't always there. Vintage uniformed attendants emerged from side paths and took up positions at queue entrances, gently swinging ropes closed, redirecting empty space with all the solemn patience of ushers seating an invisible crowd. The park's geography had stopped belonging to daylight. Maribel sent Rowan to the old bumper boats sector with a wrench and a ring of tags. Ride 7 breach check, she said. He didn't argue. He just went. I stayed with her at center midway while the carousel shuddered once and began to turn without power. The horses rose and fell in total darkness, their poles clicking softly. Music poured out of dead speakers, not tinny like recorded calliope but rich and wet, every note carrying a little too far. The melody made the back of my teeth ache. Leave the midway, Maribel snapped, and this time I understood why the rule existed before I obeyed it. We retreated to the shelter of the arcade entrance as the migrating shapes from the Ferris wheel approached the carousel perimeter. As soon as the first reached the ring of the ride, the horses' painted eyes seemed to shift. Not come alive. A line. Open places appeared between mirrored columns where there had been only decoration seconds before. The moving things folded themselves into those intervals and vanished one by one into the carousel's turning body. Habitat transfer. Roost to nest. Across the midway, one of the vintage employees lifted a gloved hand and tipped his cap toward the carousel like a station master acknowledging an arrival. Under his arm was that same future newspaper. I caught the date again in a flash of reflected light and had the absurd thought that maybe tomorrow's weather would already be printed somewhere in the dark. Then I saw former employees. At least I think that was what they were. 3 people stood outside the inner fence near the employee lot, beyond any place guests could have wandered, watching the park through the bars as if they had done it many times before. No uniforms, no badges, just coats against the night and the still posture of people waiting for a familiar process to finish. One raised a hand when Maribel looked that way, not seeking entry, just acknowledging the shift. Maribel did not wave back, but her jaw tightened. They quit? I asked. Months ago. One left last year, she said. Then why are they here? I told you. Rowan's voice came over the radio from somewhere near the northern service lane, breath short with motion. Nobody leaves clean. Static swallowed the rest. The migration widened. Sound flowed ahead of bodies. Warm zones shifted from ride to ride. Inactive speakers crackled alive long enough to call something forward, then died again. Q rails hummed under my fingers when Maribel had me close one access line to keep a path from branching toward the outer promenade. At the far end of Old Harbor Lane, the Hall of Mirrors flashed with moving light inside though its facade remained locked. I knew now it was not making any of this. It was just showing more of it than I could survive looking at. That was the worst part of the revelation. Not that the park was inhabited. That would have been frightening enough. It was realizing how much had already been happening around human life everywhere, in the built places we assume are ours because we paved them and named them and sold tickets inside them. Blackwater Shores hadn't become unnatural after closing. It had only become easier to hear. Rowan came sprinting back from the north sector with mud up his shins and something like soot across one sleeve. He looked exhilarated in the way some people look only when disaster finally becomes familiar terrain. Ride 7 crossed the drainage cut, he said. Temporary queue formed along the old boat's path. I tagged the north rail and it diverted. You saw the platform? Maribel asked. Just the front half. Tunnel was trying to assemble. Maribel nodded and marked something on her clipboard. Routine. She treated the words like weather data. That steadied me more than comfort would have. What happens if it finishes assembling? I asked. Rowan wiped grease on his pant leg. Depends what wants to use it. That answer stayed with me because it was the first time I grasped there were levels to all this we still weren't touching. Not one secret. A functioning web. Territories. Routes. Breeding sites, maybe. Seasonal patterns. The hidden world beneath Blackwater Shores wasn't random. It was ecology wearing amusement park architecture because amusement park architecture had turned out to be useful. The maximum revelation didn't arrive as one speech. It arrived as a series of things I had already seen clicking into a single shape while the park moved around me. The extra Ferris wheel car was not an error. It was a transit compartment forming during active transfer. The Hall of Mirrors was not a portal. It was an observation blind looking into overlapping habitat states. Ride 7 was not a lost attraction. It was a temporary migration corridor the park's own systems recognized before humans did. The vintage employees were not ghosts replaying old routines. They were wardens or mimics, or park-adapted attendants maintaining the boundaries that kept traffic orderly. Even the rules made a hard practical kind of sense once stripped of superstition. Don't look too long where observation invites attention. Count once because repeated focus stabilizes what should stay transitional. Never enter the train tunnel after the final departure because den routes rewrite themselves around human paths. Leave when carousel music starts because a feeding or nesting territory is changing hands. Don't acknowledge the vintage uniforms because recognition strengthens the mask they use. Avoid Ride 7 because unfinished corridors absorb what enters them. Count exits at sunrise because boundaries loosen when the ecosystem settles, and something always tests the edge before day fixes the map again. Blackwater Shores was not haunted. It was inhabited, and overnight staff were caretakers of a preserve built by accident over something older than the park itself. I had spent years believing empty places became empty because people stopped using them. That belief died before dawn. After 3 in the morning the work got worse because understanding a system doesn't make you immune to being inside it. It just tells you what to fear next. Maribel split us up by sightline. Rowan took the family section. I was assigned the Westgate service corridor and the arcade flank, where 2 speaker clusters kept flaring alive with fragments of music that needed documenting. She made me repeat the procedure back to her twice. Listen first. Smell for sugar or lake water. Test air temperature with the back of the hand before crossing any threshold. If a path feels warmer on one side than the other, don't straddle it. If I saw a vintage employee blocking a route, take the longer way. If an exit sign appeared where there hadn't been one during daylight, mark it and keep clear until sunrise count. Why sunrise? I asked. Because that's when they try doors. Simple. Horrible. Useful. I moved through the arcade with my flashlight low and my clipboard pressed against my forearm to keep the pages from rattling. Dead game cabinets stood in rows on either side behind metal grates. The air inside smelled of dust, stale carpet, and that drifting burnt popcorn note that had become the night's alarm bell. Twice I heard claws or wheels or something in between skittering through the wall voids. Once a skee-ball lane rolled a ball by itself with a hollow wooden knock that made me flinch hard enough to laugh at myself after. Professionalism becomes very small in moments like that. It narrows to breathing quietly and writing clearly. Near the West Gate corridor, I found an exit sign glowing above a door that did not exist during my orientation walk. Same green pictogram as the real ones. Same metal casing. Same bolt pattern. The problem was that it hovered 3 feet to the left of a mural painted on cinder block where no doorway had ever been cut. I marked it on the sheet and called Maribel. "Do not approach," she said immediately. "Any sound from the other side?" I listened. Behind the false exit there came the soft chatter of a crowd waiting patiently in line. Not distressed. Not urgent. Just expectant. "Yeah," I said, and my voice came out lower than I meant it to. "Good. That means it's not a breach yet." Good had become a very flexible word at Blackwater Shores. When I turned from the fake exit, a vintage uniformed attendant was standing at the far end of the corridor, holding a dustpan. He had appeared without enough space or time for walking to explain it. His face looked ordinary until you tried to settle on details. Then those details kept slipping into different ages. Older around the mouth, younger around the eyes, smooth skin with hands too lined for it. He tipped the dustpan slightly toward the mural as if acknowledging my report, then continued on his way without making a sound. I did not acknowledge him back. At 3:45, the park began to settle. Not calm. Settle. The Ferris wheel stopped cycling. The carousel kept turning but more slowly, its music thinning until only the upper notes carried. The warm pockets in the air shrank to localized zones around rides instead of whole pathways. Over the radio, Rowan reported the tunnel route was quiet, but the station tenant wanted another note left before dawn. Maribel answered that she'd handle it herself. I realized then that the job was not survival in the way I had first imagined. It was husbandry, monitoring, correction, a long-running agreement between humans and a place too structured to be wilderness and too alive to be machinery. At some point before first light, while checking a gate near the lakeside promenade, I looked through the fence and saw the 3 former employees were still there. One had a thermos. One leaned against a truck with deactivated parking tags still hanging from the mirror. They were not trying to get in. They were just present like relatives outside an operating room. I wondered whether they came because they missed the work, because something in them had tuned itself permanently to the park's nightly rhythms, or because part of them never left once they had learned how much existed here after dark. I didn't ask. I wasn't ready to hear an answer that sounded too much like my own future. Dawn at Blackwater Shores did not begin with sunlight. It began with counting. Maribel called us back to the security office annex where the gate schematics were pinned on corkboard, and every exit on the property had a corresponding metal tag. There were more tags on the board than I remembered from orientation. Some were old, lacquer flaking off the stamped numbers. Others looked newly cut. Maribel handed me a pencil and a paper map instead of the tablet. "Rule 7, she said. "Now you find out why it matters." We split the property into thirds. Rowan took the lakeside. Maribel took the northern service roads. I took the main guest paths and exterior midway. For every visible exit, employee gate, maintenance door, dock roll-up, removable fence panel, and emergency breakaway route, I had to verify 2 things. First, whether it physically existed in daylight space. Second, whether it matched the number on the dawn inventory sheet. The first few were normal enough to make me think maybe the night's worst was over. Main gate east, present and locked. Main gate west, present and locked. Delivery dock 3, present and barred. Then I reached the old picnic lawn access and found 2 exits where there should have been 1. Not duplicate doors. Two distinct openings in the perimeter fence separated by 6 feet of chain link that daylight memory insisted had always been continuous. One was the rail service gate. The other stood open onto a tree line I did not recognize, beyond which I could hear gulls and distant ride music at the same time. I did not step closer. "Maribel," I said into the radio, keeping my eyes on both openings. "Extra exit at picnic lawn." Her answer came instantly. "Mark and hold position. Do not make eye contact with anything outside it." I hadn't planned to, but the instruction made my stomach sink in advance of the possibility. The air around the false opening was warm enough to touch. The smell there wasn't popcorn this time. It was wet lumber, lake algae, and fried dough. Place smell. A whole separate atmosphere. I kept my gaze fixed on the hinge line of the rail gate while waiting, and in the edge of my vision I saw movement beyond the other threshold. Not coming toward me, moving laterally, as if something out there was following its own perimeter on the far side. Maribel arrived with bolt cutters, 3 tag chains, and Rowan at her shoulder carrying a bucket of metal brackets. Neither of them looked at the false opening directly. "Count aloud," she told me. "What?" "The exits. Current visible only. Count aloud while we work." I understood after 2 numbers. Attention management. If the park was built from routes and observation and repeated human habits, then counting the correct boundaries out loud was part of fixing them. I counted each confirmed real exit in the sector while Maribel looped chain through the rail gate and Rowan fastened a bracket to the fence post between the real and false openings. He worked quickly, almost gently. When he tightened the last bolt, the warm air from the false threshold gusted once against my face, carrying the sound of a crowd inhaling together. Then the extra opening folded shut. There isn't a cleaner way to describe it. Fence post air light. One moment there was a second exit. The next there wasn't. No flash. No distortion. Just absence corrected. "Again," Maribel said. I recounted. This time the number matched the dawn sheet. By the time the eastern sky had begun to pale over the lake, we had done that at 6 separate points across the property. A maintenance lane with an extra breakaway panel. A staff corridor ending in a door to nowhere. A guest gate opening onto a midway that belonged to the mirrored park instead of the daylight one. Each false exit carried its own smell, its own temperature, its own faint acoustic residue from whatever route it would have offered if left open. Every one of them had to be identified not by superstition but by inventory. Containment through procedure. That's all a night shift at Blackwater Shores really was, if you wanted the honest version simple enough to speak aloud. At sunrise proper, the music stopped. It didn't fade. It ceased. Warm air thinned. The burnt popcorn smell broke apart on the breeze and became ordinary stale grease from dormant concession stands. Gulls replaced calliope. The park looked tired, ugly, manageable. Ferris wheel still. Carousel dead. Children's train tunnel just a black concrete mouth behind lock chain. Daylight lies beautifully. We opened only the verified gates. Maribel signed the migration log. Rowan delivered his final maintenance note to the abandoned train station and came back with the clipboard empty. No one mentioned quitting. No one asked whether I was coming back the next night. The assumption sat there because the assumption was safer than the question. I told myself I'd finish the week. 6 months later, I was still there. That's the part one have the hardest time explaining to anyone who hasn't stood inside the park between 3 in the morning and dawn, listening to routes settle. I planned to quit after my first week. I even drafted the message in my phone twice. But each morning after shift, when I got home and lay down, I found myself listening for music under traffic noise. On my days off, I checked the weather over the lakeshore and wondered how warm the midway would be after midnight. Once, while walking into a grocery store, I stopped cold and counted the automatic doors before I went through them. I still do that now. Any building, any lot, any hallway with bad acoustics and a smell I can't place. I count exits before I unlock anything. At Blackwater Shores, Maribel eventually stopped watching me like I might bolt. Rowan let me handle more of the migration log. I learned which warm pockets were only warnings and which ones meant a route was about to assemble. I learned that the vintage attendants preferred not to be in your direct path if you kept your eyes down and your pace steady. I learned that the Hall of Mirrors showed less when storms moved in off the lake and more during clear, cold nights. I learned to leave written notes at the train station platform without ever expecting a reply. And I learned that former employees still came by sometimes before dawn, parking beyond the inner fence with coffee cups in hand, faces turned toward the rides like people listening for an old family member to wake up in the next room. None of them stayed long. None of them stayed away. This morning, sunrise came pale and thin over the midway, and I was the one holding the clipboard while Maribel checked the last verified gate. The smell of burnt popcorn had already lifted. The Ferris wheel stood empty at 22. Rowan was down by the family section swapping tags on a maintenance panel. Everything looked ordinary enough that a day crew would be able to arrive in an hour and complain about gulls, rust, and budgets without ever understanding what had just finished happening around them. I updated the migration log in the security office, wrote down the active transfers, marked the temporary exits sealed, and signed my name where the assistant line used to feel like it belonged to somebody else. Then I turned the page to tomorrow night's maintenance schedule. Ride 7 was listed again. I stared at it for a while, listening to the park settle into daylight, and before I left, I counted the office door, the hall door, and the front gate one more time.